Welcome to episode -1 of Successful Demo. In each episode, we will analyze the theoretical and practical aspects of one or more existing cards. Right, so as you all know, FFG dropped the bomb on us a couple months back, announcing that they will no longer print any more expansions. So as far as the official Netrunner card pool is concerned, we have reached the end of Netrunner's lifespan, which implies that we've also reached the end of Successful Demo's lifespan, because without new expansions, we don't have new cards to demo. So as wonderful and as successful as this series has been, I don't see myself having too many episodes left in the tank. Once we finish Reign and Reverie, we have more or less wrapped up. So it's such a pity to drop support for such a successful video series. So I began looking at ways in which to extend the longevity of Successful Demo, and I realized that instead of looking forward to power my Successful Demo, maybe I can instead look towards the rear. If I go backwards, I can start making episodes of cards that already exist in the card pool and start numbering the episodes using the negative part of the integer number scale. So we are gonna begin with a very unconventional episode -1, work our way back and see how many we can do. So we will be covering cards that exist before Terminal Directive. Some of you might remember that Successful Demo was born out of this series called Terminal Directive Cards, where I basically did Successful Demo, but with cards from that big box. So we have a lot of ground to cover, a lot of potential, and a lot of nostalgia, as we'll be reviewing a lot of old cards and throw back to them. So to begin, to kick off this negative series, some might call it reverse Successful Demo, I'm going to do a throwback to the core set. This idea was inspired by one of my wonderful patron supporters. The patron supporters, by the way, are powering me with ideas for this reverse Successful Demo series. This patron supporter called A Dumb Brick suggested a throwback video featuring two cards from the core set in the criminal faction, Sneakdoor Beta and Femme Fatale. Very integral cards that are so integral to criminal, in fact, that they have been ported over to the revised core set post-rotation. Let's take a look at each of these cards. I'm sure you're more than acquainted with them, but there's no harm in revising what we already know. Sneakdoor Beta is a defining criminal card for two reasons. Firstly, it mechanically asserts criminals' dominance on the HQ server. As some of you might be familiar with, Shapers tend to be strongest against R&D, Anarchs strongest against Archives, and for the criminal faction, they get HQ. And Sneakdoor Beta achieves that by allowing you to access HQ even though you're not running HQ at all. It opens a doorway through Archives, which is typically a server unguarded by the corp. Sneakdoor's effect is also rather unique. In the 6-year history of the game, there are very few cards that have been printed that have an effect similar to Sneakdoor Beta. In fact, basically the only other card that changes the destination server of a run is Omar Kyung. And that's an Anarch card. So yeah, very interesting. And we will look in depth at this program because it has 3 subtle benefits that might not occur to you at first glance. It's synergy with HQ cards, it's forcing the corp to spread their defenses thinly, and punishing corps for drawing agendas early. We'll look at each of them in detail. Firstly, Sneakdoor Beta works very well with the other cards in faction, which is nice. This means that you can put all these cards in the deck and still have 15 influence left over to play around with. Cards like Emergency Shutdown and Maxwell James trigger off the successful HQ run that's provided by Sneakdoor Beta, allowing you to deny credits from your opponent by de-resing their ice. Alternatively, you could go for agenda access of HQ by playing cards such as HQ Interface and Fisk Investment Seminar, both of which will stock HQ up with lots of agendas so you can easily pick them off HQ. You can do this by either making regular HQ runs through HQ or by going the back door through Archives, whichever is easier to break into. Which brings me to my second point. Sneakdoor Beta forces the corp to spread their defenses thinly to guard against the HQ runs possible from both routes, archives and HQ. And this is a very huge benefit because not only does it slow the corp down, it also causes the defenses to be weakened. Look at the graphic on the PowerPoint. Normally, against a criminal, a corp might choose an ice configuration such as this: 1 ice on R&D, 2 on HQ, and none on archives because archives is usually irrelevant. But once the criminal player installs Sneakdoor Beta, they may be forced to choose a different ice configuration that defends their HQ better, such as this. With 1 ice on each server, it's more difficult for the runner to get into a successful run into HQ. But from the runner's perspective, this means that instead of breaking 2 pieces of ice to get into HQ previously, with Sneakdoor Beta, you only need to break 1 piece of ice, and you can choose which piece of ice you want to break, whichever is easier, the HQ ice or the archives ice. And this means that, in effect, the cost of getting into HQ is halved. Instead of paying the tax for 2 ice that are on HQ, you only need to pay the tax of 1 ice, and the cheaper ice you get to choose, whether it's the archives ice or HQ ice. This really helps shore up one of criminals' weaknesses, which is that breakers are inefficient and it's very expensive to break ice. So this is a very elegant way to shore up criminals' weakness. When we are presented with a game balance problem, corp ice are too strong and criminal breakers are too weak, how would you as a game designer balance the game? Would you make criminal breakers more efficient? Would you give criminals more efficient economy engines? Well, those are boring ways to boost criminals' power level. You could do something more creative and subtle, such as introducing a card like Sneakdoor Beta, which passively forces the corp to spread their defenses more thinly, and as an indirect result, it is cheaper to get into HQ for the runner, so they can kind of get by with their inefficient breakers. That's what we are getting at with Sneakdoor Beta, and that's the subtle benefit that it brings to the table. The last benefit of Sneakdoor is that it abuses the early game like no other card. What tends to happen in the early game is that the corp will typically have 1 or 2 agendas in their hand at the start of the game or a few turns in. They can't get rid of these agendas, they can't score them, because to do so they will need to protect the centrals first, protect the remote, and then spend time and money scoring the agenda. All the while, the runner is busy pressuring them, and without Jackson Howard, which used to exist pre-rotation, they cannot simply put those HQ agendas back into R&D as easily as they did before. This means that now again, in today's context, Sneakdoor Beta can definitely fetch these agendas from HQ into the runner score area, giving the runner a very early lead. Sneakdoor is a lot less relevant in the mid to late game, when agendas tend to all have been either scored or stolen, and the remainder are left in R&D. Whenever the corp draws an agenda, they will most likely jam it in the remote, which is far safer than HQ, because with Sneakdoor out, the runner has 2 ways into the remote, but for the remote, 2 ways into HQ, but only 1 route into the remote. So as long as the remote's amply defended, the criminals will find it difficult to get in. So this is why you would typically run 2 or even 3 copies of Sneakdoor Beta in your criminal deck. Even though Sneakdoor Beta does not stack with itself, there is no point in installing multiple copies of it. You still want the multiple copies in your deck to ensure that you draw 1 early on, because that is when it's most effective. Right, another couple of downsides to discuss about Sneakdoor. It's not all roses out here. It is pretty expensive to install. As I said, it's an early game card, and 4 to install is a tough call early on, especially if you don't have a sure gamble in your opening hand. If you have run-based synergy out there, it will soften the blow. Right, so cards like Gabriel Santiago, your identity ability, allows you to recoup a fraction of this install cost as soon as you install it, which is really nice. The other problem with Sneakdoor Beta is that it hogs a lot of memory, which is still a pressing problem for criminals. They don't have a lot of consoles that give much memory, so you have to accommodate your breaker suite in addition to Sneakdoor in your rig. This is quite a tall ask, and this is why Sneakdoor tends to go best with Armor, which does a lot of good things with Sneakdoor Beta. It only takes up 1 memory and still manages to break most ice. You don't need a Fractal, Killer, and Decoder taking up lots of memory. Armor at 1 memory solves your problems, and Armor feeds off Sneakdoor because with Sneakdoor beta, you are encouraged to make multiple runs into HQ, and that charges up your Armor by giving it virus counters. Let's move on to another breaker, Femme Fatale. This is the most expensive icebreaker ever printed since the core set and remains so to this day. It's a very weird breaker because with most other breakers, their primary effect is to break ice. But for Femme Fatale, I would argue that its sentry breaking ability is its secondary effect, because you would typically install Femme Fatale for its primary effect, the ice bypass. This ability to bypass a chosen piece of ice effectively makes Femme Fatale an infinite strength breaker that breaks subroutines for 1 credit apiece. That's pretty good, right? It's like Armor Core. If you don't have to pump your breaker using money, you are basically breaking ice fairly efficiently, and that's good. The only problem with Femme really is its prohibitive install cost. At 9 to install, that is too huge of a tempo hit to justify in most cases, which is why Femme Fatale is almost always run with some sort of way to cheat Femme Fatale into play, right? A dumb brick who suggested this card said this in their Femme Fatale submission. They mentioned that their personal favorite deck with Femme Fatale when they started Netrunner was a Shaper deck with 3 Factorial Femmes, that's a lot of Femmes, and Test Run plus Scavenge combo. There's nothing quite as fantastic as winning a game where you get to use Femme Fatale as your only breaker. And that's the cool part about Femme. It is just like Armor Core. It's kind of like a universal breaker in that there's basically no ice out there that can stop Femme's bypass ability. And because of that, you can potentially get by games without other breakers other than Femme, because Femme does the trick. It is limited to only a single piece of ice, so you have to be very tactical about installing it. Let's move on to the synergies. As a Dumbrick mentioned, Test Run Scavenge is typically the popular way in which to get Femme on the table for cheap, but there have been many ways to get Femme Fatale onto the table ever since the core set was printed. As time gone on, we've seen cards like Compile, Retrieval Run, and even from Adam, Emergent Creativity. These cards make Femme all the more better because it offsets the 9 install cost. Today we won't be looking at any of these cards. We are playing Criminal after all, so we are going to select a Criminal synergistic card, and we do have one in Credit Kiting. This card is effectively a modded for Femme Fatale, except that the discount brought to the table is not just 3 credits, it's 8 credits. That's wonderful. Right, so Femme is going to come in for cheap, and it's going to bypass all the big ice and make a mockery of it. To quote a Dumbrick again, I think people would love to see this card as the star of the deck. But then again, that could just be my bias. Well, a Dumbrick, you are not alone. I love having Femme Fatales, and many of them, the more the merrier. With 3 Credit Kitings and 3 Femme Fatales, I can easily blank a lot of the corpse ice at my whim. The Femmes just keep coming, and they keep invalidating my opponent's ice. This is going to be awesome. It means that the big ice are now nothing! Alright, so that is going to be the plan of our deck. We are going to use Sneakdoor and Femme Fatale to our advantage. And this is how it looks like. To compensate for the fact that my successful demo on Lisa was a DJ Fenris Lisa, we are now going to play a proper Lisa deck, one that goes full tag me. Right? You notice that Credit Kiting is a card that tags yourself, so we are not going to bother with clearing tags, we're just going to embrace them. And this allows us to play a lot of cards that are very explosive. They give you a lot of burst economy at the expense of tags, of course. But you'll notice in the resource section that we are also running a bunch of resource protection and meat damage defense in Paparazzi. Even though we are going tag me, we want some protection as well. We don't want to auto-lose to high-profile target or boom. So we have these cards to support our tag me strategy. Now, the amazing thing about this deck is that, Sneakdoor Beta is really helpful in that by thinning the corpse ice defenses, and by making HQ easier to access, we are enabling all these powerful economic swing cards. On the left, you see the cards that provide us with big burst economy. Credit Kiting, as mentioned, requires a successful run. So Sneakdoor, thinning ice defenses allows us to more easily get that successful run, and hence the 8 credit discount. Hot Pursuit, on the other hand, is a 7 credit gain And as mentioned, because the corp will divert some ice from HQ onto archives, Hot Pursuit becomes easier to land. On the right half of the screen, you see cards that instead make the corp poor. The left half, you get rich. The right half, the corp gets poor. Diversion of funds, the new account siphon, is very effective at doing that. Again, with Sneakdoor thinning ice defenses, and with Femme invalidating big ice, diversion of funds becomes a lot better to play. And after a successful diversion of funds, you can even consider shutting down their ice and, punishing them for attempting to res such big ice in your face. So this is a full-on credit denial and, swimming in cash deck. We just have to watch out for those nasty kill decks that, end our day very quickly. Let's head into a game full of throwbacks and nostalgia with some new cards to add some spice, some oomph to this wonderful deck. Today our opponent is PU. Well, my opponent thinks that they can simply throw potatoes at old people to knock them down and out. That's what we saw with Potatoes versus Omar Kyung way back then. But this one isn't gonna be an easy fight for my opponent, because we are sporting Lisa Thunder herself, which has a 50 card deck size. So this is going to be pretty interesting. A thicker deck versus some mill. Now, we keep our opening hand because it has everything we want to have. Lots of early money and an Ormakur, so we can immediately get to breaking ice, as soon as turn 1. And on turn 2, we set up our Sneakdoor and run into HQ. We Paragon to see Diversion of Funds, which we definitely keep on top of the stack, and then draw it using Lisa's ability. So this is what Paragon does. It does card filtering. We look at the top card of our deck. We usually activate Paragon before Lisa. We look at the top card. If it's something we want, we keep it and then we draw it with Lisa. If we don't want it, it goes to the bottom of our deck. Now we see Biovault again and again in HQ, and we choose not to trash it because I want to charge up my Ormakur at this point. Right? Interestingly, here my opponent decides to ice archives instead of overdrawing to pitch Breach Dome in the bin. But that's because we are running Sneakdoor Beta. So Sneakdoor Beta actually allows us to farm Ormakur counters via archives. Normally we can't do that against PU because they'll put Breach Domes in the bin, making it very difficult to run archives, access, and gain power virus counters because we'll take damage. But with a route into HQ, our opponent's forced to ice archives, and the archives ice is either Komainu or Kakugo, I believe, one of the two, because we were shown that with Celebrity Gift. In the meantime though, we are not going to deal with the archives ice, we're just going straight in for a diversion of funds since we need that money, and we draw into another diversion of funds, scouted out by our Paragon. So looking pretty good for us, even though we took net damage from Kakugo. We are able to siphon our opponent and more importantly deny even more credits with the freshly drawn emergency shutdown. So that denies 4 credits from our opponent. It's kind of like economic warfare. We spend 1 click and a card, they lose 4 credits. It's worth it. Now we go again for another diversion of funds here. Again, I'm taking 1 net damage, but I don't mind because my entire hand is garbage. Duplicate Ormakur, duplicate Paragon, and a Femme Fatale, which isn't that useful right now. So we diversion of funds, and we see Hot Pursuit, another interesting card that we can potentially use to boost our economy. Now I need to start taking note of damage. The damage is definitely piling up, and we are not too happy about taking too much damage because not only are we losing cards from our hand, but we are also losing cards from our stack thanks to PU's ability. So I'm going to scout out my opponent's Archives Ice here by running Sneakdoor into their Komainu. With 4 cards in hand, I can more than afford to break this. And I'm going to see 1 card from the HQ, probably an Agenda. Nah, that's not an Agenda, that's a Breach Dome. That's so annoying. I have to make the decision between trashing it now or leaving it there and getting an Ormakur counter. It's a tough choice. I'm really not sure here. An Ormakur counter would be really nice because I want to get to that magic 5 virus counter mark to save myself against the likes of Nancy and Lindsay. Those are very nasty ice I cannot afford to hit. So I eventually decide to trash the Breach Dome for the simple reason that if I'm going to charge my Ormakur, I'm going to be running HQ repeatedly. so I better make sure that there's nothing spiky in hand. Now my opponent installs double advances and NGO front in the remote and immediately resists it in case I run interdiction. I haven't actually shown my restricted card yet. Turns out I don't think I'm running a restricted card here, so yeah, very interesting. My opponent preemptively playing carefully against the NGO front. Meanwhile, I'm just gonna hot pursuit to HQ, disregarding and disrespecting my opponent's net damage. I'm just gonna get a HQ access, get some money, and then I see a Komainu. Okay, Komainu in hand, good to know. Now, my opponent's running a lot of low strength ice, which is wonderful for me. My armor core will have no problem busting through all these ice. Tax is not a concern because we are filthy rich. And now I'm gonna drop my Maxwell James while they're poor. They have 0 credits, plus 7 from the NGO, 8 from the NGO front. So they could theoretically trash my Maxwell James, but that's gonna set them back in terms of tempo and allow me to set up. Now I'm starting to draw into my resource rig here. I have dummy box and I have rook trading. What you really need to get your resource rig set up is a wireless net pavilion. That way it is actually expensive to trash your resources. So while my opponent takes IPO money, presumably that's why they didn't trash the Maxwell James. They wanted to take advantage of the 8 credits they get from NGO front to play their IPO while they can, before I land another diversion of funds or something similar. Right, so it's over to me and I have a pretty difficult choice here. There are lots of possible moves I can take here. I really want to make a central run, but running through archives for HQ access is expensive. Komainu having 5 subroutines and all, and I'm not very safe running R&D at this point in time. Again, a Lindsay, a Nancy, or even a DNA tracker all will do a lot of damage to me, and we can't have that right now. So we are gonna take the safest route, which is the Komainu that can be broken for credits, and I won't have to suffer any net damage. We see a Bhagat on the top of my stack, a one-off Bhagat that costs 4 influence. I have to keep it. And I also draw my wireless net pavilion, so now I can actually set up my resource rig. I have all the resources I need to drop and to protect my own resources, but the problem here is I don't have enough clicks to play all of them. So I hit my rook trading for cash, deciding to set up my resource rig at a later time. So next turn I plan to install the wireless net, the dummy box, and the Bhagat. So that way my HQ runs will gain more mileage. So that will be really cool. Unfortunately, as some of you might know, dummy box only works if you have a resource in hand. If you don't, it cannot prevent the trashing of resources when my opponent takes an action to trash resources. So that's a bit of a problem, but we are going to risk it. I'm going to risk it for the biscuit. Drop wireless net and dummy box right now. I'm not going to drop Bhagat because I don't want it immediately erased from my board the moment I throw it down. I want to at least throw down the Bhagat and at least get one trigger by running HQ before my opponent gets the chance to trash it. So here we go. I'm going to go in for a Bhagat run right about now. First drawing a couple of cards, then playing the Bhagat, third click. Here I was hoping to draw into some resources. That way I would be able to defend my resource rig. Otherwise my opponent, as I said, can easily just trash my Bhagat. I did not find any resources to protect my Bhagat with, so instead I'm going to install a breaker in Ether. This is my insurance policy. I'm now filthy rich. I have 12 credits on rook trading and another 15 in my hand, so that money is not a problem. The only problem is that my opponent just purged virus counters, so I can't even break the 1 strength Komainu on archives, which is why I needed the Ether here. I'm going to break all the Komainu subroutines using Ether. This prevents me from accessing HQ, but it still counts as a successful Sneakdoor HQ run, which means Bhagat triggers, Paragon triggers, Lisa Talking Thunder triggers. Well, that's a lot of mileage, even though I'm not accessing cards at all. We'll take those. Here it is very important to note that Ether does not replace my access phase. The access phase still happens, it's just that instead of accessing 1 card from HQ, like I normally would, I access 0. This is an important distinction because it means that since I did actually proceed to the access phase and stole no agendas and trash no cards, Armor Core gets its virus counter. So Ether and Armor Core, despite both being AI breakers, seemingly they anti-synergize. Actually, on Ether runs, you can charge up Armor Core counters. So that's quite important because this means I can break Komainus in the future. And I know that there's at least one more somewhere out there. The one on archives, I'm going to render useless by femming it. For those of you unaware about rules interactions, both Komainu's gain subroutine ability and Fem's bypass ability both trigger during encounter with the Komainu. Since it's my turn, I'm running. Femme will trigger before Komainu, and Femme will allow me to bypass the Komainu, thereby fizzling the Komainu trigger. So I'm able to get past Komainu using Femme's bypass ability for 0 credits, because Komainu has no inherent subroutines. So here we get the Paragon, the Bhagat, the Laser triggers, but we also get the HQ access. And by this time, I'm getting fairly frustrated because it's been a long while. Our opponent has drawn through 40% of the deck and we haven't seen a single agenda. It's not like they have been taking agendas out of circulation by playing cards like Drudge Work or by scoring agendas themselves. The score piles are all blank. Where are my agendas? This is actually rather frustrating. It's as though they're running government takeover or something. Anyway, I access the BioVault for what seems like the umpteenth time, and I have to decide at this point whether to trash it. Money's not the issue. The problem is I will not get the Omakua counter. So I chose not to get the Omakua counter, and because I'm now flooded with cards, I'm forced to play some of them, including Emergency Shutdown on the Kakugo, to effectively make my opponent lose 4 credits. Even though my opponent's filthy rich, they're at 20 credits, but every credit counts, especially when I'm playing so many credit denial cards. In a span of a single diversion of funds, my opponent went down from 20 credits to 11. And now after scoring this House of Knives, they'll be down to 8. Oh shoot, they scored a House of Knives. Bloody hell, that's where all the agendas were. Dang, okay, that sucks. What can I do? Well, I'm gonna first play a Mars for Martians. That will very effectively get me enough money to fuel the rest of my game. I don't think I need more than 21 credits for the rest of this game. The question is whether I can actually find those agendas. I continue getting the Bhagat MILF from my opponent, and finally we access our first agenda this game, an Obo Carter Protocol, which I dropped my entire hand to steal. That's where Lisa Talking Thunder comes in handy. Her card draw allowed to compensate for House of Knives damage, allowing me to actually make the successful run with 4 cards in hand. Otherwise, I would have accessed it with only 2 cards in hand and be vulnerable to the likes of Snare. So yeah, Lisa's ability very good against Jinteki because it pushes you over the edge to steal Obo Carters from Centrals. Now my opponent jams something in server 1 again, and goodness forbid that's yet another House of Knives. I don't really have the energy to run my opponent's remote yet, so I'm going to get another Bhagat trigger since it's free. My opponent is not bothering with icing archives after I femmed the Komainu and effectively blanked it. So I'm getting free HQ runs here. A free credit every turn from Paragon, a free card draw every turn from Lisa, and free Bhagat mills. We take those. Then the next move is to poke R&D. It's finally time to see what ice my opponent has on R&D, bearing in mind that Ether can take care of anything my opponent throws at me. In this case, it's a Morseless, so we are going to break it using Ether because we really cannot be affording to take any more net damage. Our stack is down to the single digits, and we could very well lose to net damage here, especially considering my opponent has two more ammo in this, in the holster, with the House of Knives there. The main purpose of the R&D run really was to just force them to lose more credits. I was quite tempted to run server 1 there, but I decided to give it a pass as my opponent continued to take credits. I now am faced with the decision of whether to run the remote or whether I should find some other way to get into R&D, because as it stands, I need 5 strength or Makua to get into R&D, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. Yeah, it's a bit tricky. You also must remember that there could be a lot of agendas in archives. There are currently 4 face down cards thanks to Bhagat. So yeah, the game could very well be in archives, right? All I need is an Obo Carter and 1 other agenda, and I can win off archives. So one thing I actually should have done at this point was to check archives without hitting the breach domes that are in the bin. And what I could have done was to break Komainu using Ether and access 0 cards from archives. That would have been the perfect play. That is, top level play that allows you to know what's in the bin. And if the game is in the bin, you just run it normally. If the game's not yet in the bin, well, life goes on as normal. So that is what I should have done, especially given that I had infinite credits. So breaking Komainu with Ether wasn't an issue. Instead, by running HQ here, I am forced to draw cards from Deezer's ability, which is now becoming a hindrance. I have 3 clicks left and I need to spend all these cards. But I don't want to spend these cards. I want these cards to be hit points. I need them to buff up my hand in case I hit Obokatas, in case my opponent throws more damage at me. At this point, I don't really care about what's in my hand anymore. It's completely irrelevant. I don't need to play any of these cards. I'm too rich. I don't need Miss Bones or Hot Pursuit that's in my hand right now. Certainly not Mars for Martians. I still have 12 credits on Rook Trading on the table, mind you. The problem here is I need to win the game quickly before my opponent manages to deck me, before I'm forced to discard cards from my hand, which are effectively hit points. So I'm going to run server 1 here. Maybe it's an agenda, something like an Obokata that they are slow rolling in the remote. Keep in mind that I already make a successful HQ run this turn, the Sneakdoor on HQ, meaning that Maxwell James is active and I immediately use it here to de-res the innermost Kakugo that my opponent showed me. So that avoids me 1 net damage, and now I get to the base of the server where I'm greeted with a Hokusai Grid. Another thing that I'm calculating is the last card of my deck. The bottom card of my deck was the Notoriety, which would have really helped me gain an agenda point for free, and I certainly could have used it here. Instead, it was milled off my stack as I got hit by House of Knives and House of Knives and Hokusai damage. So I went for the Hail Mary on the bin, and it turns out all the agendas were in there all this while. That's 4 points of agendas, enough to win even without running the remote. So despite very nearly running out of deck, we managed to pull out the victory. The Bhagat Sneakdoor combo certainly impressed me. I mean, I did not think too much when I first put it in, but it turns out man on top of car with megaphone is pretty darn good, and not just for the memes. Being able to mill 5 cards this game, it allowed me to put the win in the bin. And the best part is it synergizes so well with Sneakdoor, which gives you 2 routes into HQ. And using Sneakdoor's effect still allows you to trigger Bhagat. So very lovely combo right there. Sure, it's a problem that you're running this very high influence card as a one-off in your 50 card deck, but once again, because we are running Lisa Talking Thunder specifically, you're gonna find it sooner or later between your insane draw, which allows you to plow through your deck so quickly, alongside Paragon's filtering, which I managed to get this game. I buried quite a few cards, and that allowed me to access my Bhagat that much sooner. Another interesting thing about Bhagat is that it wasn't invulnerable. As a resource, playing as a tag me runner, it was definitely susceptible to trashing via my opponent's basic action card. However, because I had Wireless Net Pavilion and Dummy Box installed, this combo allows me to threaten an expensive trash. It will cost my opponent 4 credits and a click to trash the Bhagat, and if I prevent the trash with Dummy Box, then they will have to fork out another 4 credits and click to attempt to trash my Bhagat again. And this is where grip bluffing comes into play. I think this is an aspect that has been minimized as the game has evolved, but it's one of the fun parts about playing run-based criminal back in the day. The corp never knows what's in your hand, and you can always save up these powerful events, run events, and cards like Emergency Shutdown to thwart the corp's plans. Well, same thing here. My opponent doesn't know that I have no resources in hand to feed Dummy Box with. If I don't have resources in my hand, I cannot use Dummy Box's ability to prevent Bhagat from being trash. But here's the thing, my opponent doesn't know this, right? They are not Harish Chandra Corporation, so they can't see my hand, even though, as you can see, my hand here is all full of events and a Femme Fatale. There are no resources there, but my opponent doesn't know this. The ideal line of play for my opponent here would be to click to trash the Bhagat for 4 credits. They're so rich they can afford it, and yeah, that would have basically quelled my HQ pressure with Bhagat. Instead, my opponent was very afraid. They didn't know what was in my hand, and they couldn't afford the prospect of potentially losing a lot of money and a lot of clicks to on a Bhagat trash that might not even happen. I might have 3 resources in my hand they might spend an entire turn and 12 credits and still not get the Bhagat off the table. That is a game-losing prospect. So that's where the bluffing element comes into play. I think a lot of people have the misconception that Netrunner's bluffing aspect is only on the corp side with the ambushes and all, but as the runner, depending on how your deck is constructed, you can certainly feign certain lines of play that your opponent just cannot conceive, and this is one of them. Dummy box Wireless Net Pavilion, not always invulnerable, but there's no way for the corp to know this. Right, back to our successful demo. We talked about Sneakdoor and its wonderful synergy with Bhagat. What about Femme Fatale? Well, it saved me so many credits because I managed to target a prime piece of ice in Komainu, reducing the tax of Komainu from 1 per subroutine to nothing! There was no tax on Komainu at all. For those of you who are still unaware of the ruling, both cards share the same on-encounter trigger, and because I'm making runs on my turn, my card triggers first. Femme Fatale bypasses Komainu before it gains subroutines. And since Komainu has no latent subroutines on it, well, 0 credits to bypass every time. And that adds up. If I use my Armor Core to break Komainu again and again, it would have cost me 21 credits over the course of the entire game. Instead, my opponent had no ice to replace the Femme Komainu on Archives, and as a result, I got into HQ repeatedly for free. And Femme really complements my unconventional breaker suite really well. I'm playing 2 different AI breakers, which is pretty ridiculous, but both with their respective drawbacks, which means I need some sort of breaker support, and Femme fits the bill perfectly, allowing you to bypass any gnarly piece of ice in the game. Femme is almost a universal breaker. Well, it cannot, you will get punished for attempting to bypass an Anansi, but even then you can still break it with Femme as a killer. So yeah, a very, very nice way to ensure that you get into a server and to shore up any weaknesses of AI breakers, such as running into ice that cannot be broken by AI breakers, for example. Yeah, and then what else? Yeah, that's about it for this episode. I think we have overrun time for now. And because Femme Fatale and Sneakdoor are both cards from the core set, inevitably there'll be so many synergies that have been designed further down the road. There's so many nombos and combos that I just simply can't list them all. Why don't you share your favorite nombos and combos with these core cards? Leave them in the comment section and share them for the world to hear and see. Thanks once again to the Dumb Brick for suggesting these 2 cards. I really love the throwback aspect, and I hope you are satisfied with this particular episode. For the rest of patrons, I sent the survey earlier. If you still haven't taken part, be sure to do so. I'm still accepting suggestions, and who knows, yours might appear on a subsequent video, just like a Dumb Bricks did. In the meantime, as always, thanks for watching. Happy net running. See you next time.